Welcome and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the three-part webinar series on affordable housing, Westchester's housing crisis. My name is Joan Grangenois-Thomas, and I am here representing Sustainable Portchester Alliance. And my three partners in crime that helped to get this thing organized are Peter Bernstein with Irvington Activist and Michael Yellen out of Enrage in New Rochelle. So we want to just welcome you again and to let you know that this is the first in a three-part series to explore the history, discuss solutions, and create an action agenda to bring fair and affordable housing to all of Westchester. The series was co-sponsored along with Sustainable Portchester Alliance by Community Voices Heard, again, Irvington Activists, Westchester Putnam Working Families Party. And we want to encourage you to pose questions along the way. So make sure that you pose your questions in the chat, and then we'll get to the Q&A and vet the questions to pose to our panelists. And now it is my pleasure. And again, I am here at Sustainable Portchester Alliance, but I'd like to introduce a greeting from Congressman Mondaire Jones of New York 17th Congressional District.
Hey everyone, this is Congressman Mondaire Jones. I'm so grateful to be with you all this evening, and I'm honored to represent a community with activists such as yourselves fighting for a future where everyone has a safe and stable home. As many of you know, I grew up in Section 8 housing in Rockland County. So the crisis that our communities face is personal to me. Addressing this crisis is also urgent. Over 40% of Westchester County residents are cost burdened, meaning they pay over 30% of their income towards housing. Many more who work in Westchester can't afford to live here at all, as there is no municipality in the county where a household earning the local hourly wage can afford a market rate 2-bedroom apartment. The need for affordable units in the county is over 82,000, yet very few units have been created since the county determined this need. Fighting for federal funding for Section 8 housing, public housing, and home ownership programs is a priority of mine in Congress, including as an essential element of the transportation and infrastructure bill we will soon debate in the House of Representatives. But there's also grassroots work to do to make sure that affordable housing is a priority for our communities and to remove barriers like exclusionary zoning that make development impossible in many municipalities. I'm grateful to be joining you all in that fight. So thank you to the Irvington Activists, Community Voices Heard, Sustainable Portchester, and Westchester Putnam Working Families Party for putting this event together. I look forward to our continued partnership in this fight for housing justice for all.
Awesome. Thank you. So to start exploring the history of our housing crisis, we wanted to start with a short film that was provided to us by Richard Rothstein. He's the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And again, this first part in the webinar series is to talk about the history. And so we wanted to give you some background in terms of housing and segregation in the country. So sit back and watch this video.
We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all. It overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not we think it's a good thing. We say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried. And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted the national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. The liberals and conservatives hold it. The blacks and whites hold it. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no basis to it whatsoever. The racial segregation in every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit government policy designed to create racial boundaries, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, with policies that are so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape that we see in cities all over the country. Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if wanted the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing on temporary housing because the explicit goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and near the shipyards. And they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, now in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty, and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans. And then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. At a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers. We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
So for those of you who have yet to read The Color of Law, we greatly encourage you to pick up that book. It is sobering. So now we want to turn to the main portion of our program. And I am going to turn this over to the quite capable, competent, trustworthy hands of our moderator for the evening, Juanita Lews of Community Voices Heard. Thanks, Juanita.
Thanks, Joan. And hello, everyone that's watching us on Facebook Live, that's with us right now on the webinar. So my name is Juanita Lews, the Hudson Valley Organizing Director with Community Voices Heard. And I am excited and honored to be the moderator for tonight's panel for one of our first series of the three-part series on housing here in Westchester County. So I want to introduce our panelists tonight. So first we have David Schwartz, who's the vice chair of the Westchester Putnam chapter of the Working Families Party here in the county. And we have Sheila Vereen-Massengale, who is a CVH member from Ossining. Norma Drummond, who's the commissioner of planning from Westchester County. And Joe Czajka, who's the senior vice president for Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress. So, you know, we have a panel here that has a wealth of knowledge around housing and housing access and affordability in the county. But before we jump into some of our questions, I want to get some reactions to the clip that we just saw from Mr. Rothstein around how housing segregation happened in the country. And so I want to turn it over to David first to give some reactions to what we just saw.
Thanks, Juanita. I'd like to take actually a few minutes to set that video, which was excellent, in a local context with a brief history of housing in Westchester, dating back almost half a century to 1975, when there was a court case, Berenson versus the town of Newcastle, which established important principles that in refusing to allow multifamily housing, the town was, number one, not meeting the needs of all the town's residents, and number two, not considering regional housing needs. Those were important principles. The case urged localities to adopt inclusionary zoning, and it urged governments to provide regional planning in these matters. And what it did not do, of course, was require that the housing be marketed in such a way as to be available to people of all ethnicities and races, and that's the segregation. In the 1990s, the county, in response to that call for regional planning, commissioned a study by Rutgers University that set a goal of 5,000 affordable units during the decade ahead. The county established an allocation plan which set goals for each community towards that overall goal. And it offered, and it still does, technical assistance and funds. Understand, it was offering, but not requiring. 6 years after that, 24 communities had adopted resolutions accepting their goals. 15 had never responded, and 2 had responded with resolutions and oppositions. But, and here's the important fact, fewer than half of the units had actually been built. And those that were built were overwhelmingly in communities with large concentrations of people of color, communities which actively supported the affordable housing programs and which received the bulk of county and federal dollars. A second study was commissioned later that covered the period 2005 to 2015, and it amounted to 10,768 units. So we've almost doubled the requirement from the first. And that was a very conservative figure because it didn't take into account the estimated 72,000 households in the 2000 census that were determined to be cost burden. Cost burden meaning spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. Most recently today, that figure of cost burden families in Westchester has risen, think of this, to 82,400. The problem, of course, is the word affordable. Many communities, including the county and its model ordinance, use the term meaning housing for those whose incomes are below 80% of area median income. But the problem in Westchester is that the area median income for a family of 4 is $127,500. So they would have to be earning $102,000 for us to be talking about affordable housing. It's not only a battle to win units that would be set aside as affordable. It's been a battle over the years to get a good ordinance in which income levels are low enough, down to as little as 30% of AMI, that can serve the needs of working people. Now, let me take a moment to say a special word about Yonkers as an example, really, of resistance, I would say. In 1980, the US government brought a school segregation suit. Federal Judge Leonard Sand found that school segregation, obviously, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, is tied to patterns of housing discrimination. And he ordered the city to build 600 units of housing for low-income residents in parts of the city that were not segregated racially. He also ordered the city to pass an affordable housing ordinance. What happened is well documented, and I won't go over it for time constraints. If you haven't already read Lisa Belkin's book, Show Me a Hero, or seen the TV show that was based on it, I urge you to do so. You'll understand Yonkers and Westchester better. The city almost imploded, but in 1988, they did pass an ordinance that was the best in Westchester because it established 20% set-asides as affordable in developments over 10 units. But it took the city 20 years to build the 600 units, and then the order was lifted. But when it went lifted, the affordable housing ordinance expired. So the battle to extend that ordinance took another 4 years. And when it was finally successful, it was at a lower rate of set-asides of only 10%. 33 years later, that's now, 33 years later, after the battle began, it continues today as people in Yonkers advocate for an increase in the percentage of set-asides and lower minimum income levels. A final issue that I want to bring to your attention, I've mentioned the distinction between affordable housing and fair housing. As I've said, the county made use of federal funds to further the goal of adding to the stock of affordable housing. In order to get the money, Westchester claimed, as HUD required under the 1964 Fair Housing Act, that it was, and I quote, affirmatively furthering fair housing. It was supposed to analyze, identify, and act to overcome barriers to fair housing choice. But the reality is that the county maintained that local housing ruled, and it did not act strongly. In 2006, the Anti-Discrimination Center of Metropolitan New York brought suit. And in that case, the US District Court found that the evidence was clear that Westchester had utterly failed to meet its obligation to further fair housing, and that its claim that it had was both false and fraudulent. Those are quotes. So the county in August 2009 signed a consent decree in which they agreed to build 750 units of affordable housing, 630 of which would be in communities with fewer than 3% African American and fewer than 7% Hispanic residents. The issue really was never the 750 units. Remember the numbers of units we had been talking about years before. The issue was segregation. This was a segregation case. And as part of the agreement, the county admitted that it did have the authority under state and federal law to challenge zoning rules and to compel municipalities to integrate. But we all know what happened. The Astorino administration, elected largely on the basis of opposition to the consent decree, balked at its implementation. And more recently, the Latimer administration has worked to achieve those ends. And in January, the monitor appointed by the court to oversee compliance ruled that the county had, quote, substantially met its obligations under the consent decree. Well, many of us housing advocates disagree. Craig Gurian, the Anti-Discrimination Center, which brought the case, noted that the county has not done enough to open up land for multifamily use. Remember, that was the center of the Berenson case, the use of multifamily use so that affordable housing might be possible. Only about half of the 750 units have been built in municipalities with fewer than 3% African American or 7% Hispanic residents, and others have been built in extremely difficult, if not impossible, sites. And even then, the monitor has criticized 14 predominantly white communities that still have restrictive zoning codes, and he singled out both Harrison and Pelham Manor for failing to make any changes to zoning codes in response to the decree. The county, we believe, has failed to compel those communities to improve their zoning or to integrate. I'm going to stop for time reasons, and others have much to add. But I just want to say that if we are to address the historic segregation in Westchester that the video we saw highlights throughout the nation, but is true here, there is a great deal of work for us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think that was super important for you to set the context of what we've had happen here in Westchester. And so I want to ask Norma, what were some of your thoughts from the video that we saw, and even to some of the reaction to David's comments?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me participate in your forum tonight. I'm happy that the monitor has recognized that the county has substantially completed the 750 units and many of the obligations that were included in the housing settlement. It's taken us a long time to get from the start, as David well knows, so with the administration that was at hand and what we had to deal with. So it's every single unit, whether we went out and bought a single family home and, you know, rehabbed it and turned around and marketed it and got it back out there, every single unit was well hard fought to get there. At the end of the day, we expect, hopefully by the end of this month, even, that we're going to have 751 units actually completed, but there's another 190 units that are under construction right now. So, you know, we've completed not just this, well, we will complete not just the 750, but we're actually going to be well above 900 units in the communities where we were, you know, obviously told we had to build the housing units. You know, one other point I do want to make is there is not a lot of virgin land in Westchester. In many sites that have not been developed in Westchester, there's really a reason that they have not been developed on. Okay, the steep slopes, the environmental issues, you know, wetlands and other things that are on many of these slopes. And, you know, almost nearly 1/3 of Westchester's land area is in the New York City watershed, which puts real constraints on our ability to develop those properties. And many of those properties don't have sewer and basic infrastructure in place for the ability to pursue that. But that didn't stop us. We still built 60 rental units in the town of North Salem. They don't even have a grocery store, but we were able to build units there. They're close enough to Brewster and to other places, to a train line and everything else, that it made sense to be able to work and get those units. And units, you know, now have approvals in Lewisboro and other places in the watershed area. So we've shown it is possible to build in areas that have been, yes, predominantly white, predominantly single family homes, you know, opposed to multifamily housing over the years. And we are now, you know, making inroads in terms of getting some rental units in those development, in those areas.
Wonderful, thank you. Joe, any thoughts and reactions?
Sure, Juanita, thank you, and good evening, everybody. Appreciate you having me on this webinar. You know, I had an opportunity to actually see Richard a few years ago. He was a speaker up here in the Mid-Hudson Valley. An unbelievable person. He, you know, obviously the book is fantastic. The book is actually so good that we actually used it as a textbook for our fellows program. We've bought it for our board members, and so it tells a long story. It goes into some great detail. So if you haven't read it, absolutely read it. But, you know, working for a think tank, I like to jump to potential solutions. And I think that it's critically important that we understand the history of housing, and Richard's book does that. But we also need to understand how it has evolved. And it's really important for us not to repeat the same mistakes that have been made in the past. That's why we understand and read and analyze historic information and what has happened. How do we fix those issues? But I also think that we need to accept responsibility to fix it, and we don't perpetuate the issue. That's really important as well. One of the things that struck me was the development of housing in areas that, let's just say, housing shouldn't be developed. And I'm talking in terms of environmental justice. Housing that is built for low-income families, that is next to a factory, next to a water treatment plant, next to a sewer treatment plant. That's not the place to put it. We're building, you know, and we're still doing that in some communities around the country. The home ownership opportunities of the country's Levitt towns, it's stifled wealth. The information that Richard shared in the video, it is so true. He went through the numbers. When you stifle wealth, you stifle all sorts of things, but you also perpetuate what I would call generational poverty. That and by perpetuating generational poverty, you're also stopping that next generation from attaining an education. You're stopping them from attaining wealth. And so it's just this vicious cycle that continues to go. Difficulties for the county. You know, we live in what's called a home rule state. And those decision makers at the village level, at the town level, at the city level, those are the folks that we really need to educate. Those are the folks that are looking at developments as they come in for an approval process. Those are the folks that are making those decisions. The county can't make that decision. They can assist, they can provide technical assistance, which is fabulous. And also I wanted to work off a little bit of what Norma said in terms of difficulties of building these developments. Infrastructure issues. Not every community has water and sewer, so it's extraordinarily difficult. And then I don't want to say this as a scapegoat by any means, but the cost of land, the cost of construction, the long-term cost of maintaining and operating developments, it is extraordinarily expensive. So there are so many things that are in the way. Jumping to solutions, though, I've got a whole list, and we can hopefully circle back to those. Thank you, Juanita.
Great, thank you. And so now we're gonna get into some reactions to the Westchester County Housing Needs Assessment. So, you know, David had mentioned the fact that there were a few assessments that were done over a few decades around the need for housing in the county. And then we recently had another one that was done and released right after a long, hard fight to get the funding for it and to get it released and to have the study done. You know, it highlighted a lot of different things. So it highlighted the need for more housing for Westchester residents, right? And in particular need for low-income communities, working class folks, seniors, those who are disabled and young families, right? And a lot of those communities don't have access, or constituencies don't have access to housing. And, you know, David also talked about the amount or the percentage of families that are rent burdened. And so as we talk a little bit more about the study, just in that context, you know, I would like to hear from Sheila, our member from Community Voices Heard, just to give us some of her reactions to the assessment. So Sheila, can you hear us? So as Sheila is trying to fix audio, we want to I'm going to kick this over to Norma. Oh, Sheila.
Hi.
Oh, great.
I'm here.
Oh, Sheila. Yes.
Yes. Hi, this is Sheila Vereen-Massengale. I'm a member of CVH and a leader in Ossining. I just wanted to briefly discuss what the house, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Sheila.
What the county needs assessment tells us about the housing crisis in Westchester.
Mm-hmm.
It highlights the need for a little under 12,000 units of new housing, which we feel is way under the amount of units needed in Westchester at this time. It tells us that there are very little housing options for large families, low-income people, seniors, those with disabilities, and young families, which represent the membership of Community Voices Heard. It also concerns us because it affects our children's education.
Oh, I believe we just lost Sheila, but I know one of the points she was talking about. Oh, Sheila, you back? So we're all getting used to this world of Zoom. So all of the technological issues. You back? Okay, go ahead, Sheila. Pick it up with education. Yes.
Yeah, and it concerns us because it affects our children's education and access to medical facilities. And 51% of households are severely rent burdened, paying way more than 30% of their income on rent.
Mm-hmm.
You have another question for me?
Great. Yeah. Oh, yes. No, we're going to come back. I just wanted to get some of your thoughts around how you saw the housing assessment. And so, Norma, what are some of your thoughts around it as the Commissioner of Planning when we were doing the assessment?
Yeah, thank you. So the housing needs assessment for the first time actually gives us not just the picture of the county's need, but it actually doesn't let any municipality escape from the fact that every single municipality in Westchester County has a need for affordable housing. And it shows them Joe and the work that his team did on this really spells it out for every municipality, how unaffordable their housing is, not just the market rate housing, but from a renter's perspective, from even the owner's perspective. In so many of these municipalities, when I've gone around and had the conversations with them about their piece of the pie and their story that's in this housing needs assessment, I show them that people who live in their own communities now can't afford to move to another house in their own community because the housing in these communities is just so unaffordable. So it's really, it's for the first time, the data is not just at the county level, but really hones in for every municipality. When we talk about the 11,703 units, we really kind of got that number down to the new construction that's needed. And that's why I think people are understanding or wishing the number was bigger. But the 72,000 households that are cost burdened, and actually that number doubles if you look to people who are severely, that's a severely cost burdened. It doubles for the people who are just cost burdened. That means they're paying more than 30% of their income toward their housing costs. But for those that are cost burdened, when we take a look at the units that they're in, they are likely decent, safe, and sanitary because they didn't fall into the other issues of housing needs, okay? And so that's why we don't necessarily need more housing for those 72,000 households or the 140,000 households that are cost burdened. We just need a better way to help families afford that housing. That's really what that picture shows us. That, what Mondaire in his message says, he supports Section 8 housing choice voucher. That's what we need. We need so much more rental assistance in our county to help people afford the housing that they already live in, and then that already exists here in Westchester.
Yeah, thank you, Norma. And I think given the fact that we're in this pandemic and the question of rent and rent relief is everything that people are talking about now, right? And so knowing that in the study, it already highlighted the fact that so many community members were rent burdened, and now has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So it gives just a whole new context and shines a light on some of the things that the assessment was saying. David, some of your thoughts to the assessment.
I think the assessment is an extraordinary achievement. I have to doff my hat to CVH, which was the moving force behind this to get it going. Others certainly joined in, but like everything else, it calls the shots. Like so many of the reports, it calls the shots clearly. The question for me is, what do we do as a county to follow up? And there are challenges, as Joe says. There are enormous challenges. I am as somewhat less willing than he to accept the challenges of Norma, whom I admire enormously, to accept the challenges built around arguments around open space. Conservationists with whom I work talk about there's valuable open space and there's not valuable open space. And I think if we started looking, somebody in the chat room, I think, mentioned looking at a land assessment. We really need to look more closely at which land would be appropriate for housing and which land would not. I hope we'll do that as a result of the assessment. Thanks.
And Joe, before you answer, I see a question in the chat about how are we seeing federally funded public housing in the full picture? And so we have definitely a CVH response, but it'll be good to hear what you're thinking about, and also in the context of the housing assessment.
Yeah, so let me, thank you. Let's start with the housing assessment itself. And I keep a copy with me. It's 640 pages. And so, Juanita, I want to thank, you and your crew to get to the county to the point of putting it out. But I got to tell you, there was a lot of nights and weekends. So it was not an easy task. And getting this data, understanding the data, and then pulling it down, as Norma indicated, to the municipal level, I think is extraordinarily important, because again, that's where those actions are going to take place. But I'm a numbers guy, so I just wanted to put out a few more numbers just so people start to think. And please understand that the data that we used at this point is about 4 years old. So these numbers, I'm pretty confident after doing this for 32 years, are higher than what I'm about to say. And so there was over 35,000 severely cost burdened owners. It's not just renters, but 35,000 owners. Almost 37,000 renter households were severely cost burdened. So when you hear the percentage, it's important to understand the percentage, but when you actually hear the number of households, I think it's a little bit more impactful. And what is a household? What does that mean? Assume for a moment that there's 3 people per household, and it's likely to be a bit higher than that in a lot of the rental developments. But that equates to 250,000 people that are in need. 250,000 people. That is a substantial amount of folks. And so if we're looking at assistance, we need rental assistance, choice vouchers. We need homeowner rehab. We need housing down payment closing cost assistance. We need access to home for people to age in place. Those are the types of things. Those are just some ideas. But there's very much a mismatch, and I think that we would be remiss if we did not bring attention to what is currently happening in the real estate market today. So this afternoon, one of the largest multiple listing service agencies, Hagar, Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, provided their first quarter analysis of homes in all of the counties that they serve. Westchester is clearly one of them. The current median price of a home in the county is $710,000. Now, in order to purchase that home, you have to earn roughly $230,000 a year. This assumes the bare minimum of 5% down, and of course, you need closing costs. So that family, to buy that house, needs to come to the closing table with over $78,000 ready to pluck down on the table to buy the house. So that's an amazing statistic. So I want to go just a little bit deeper, if you don't mind, Juanita. So look at, and I think, David, you stated it in your opening remarks. Today's median income, according to HUD, for a family of 4 is about $127,000. It sounds like it's a high number. So let's take that and put it in reference to the median price of a home or the market right now in Westchester County. What does $127,500 buy you? It buys you a house of about $390,000. When you look through the MLS, there are 1,200 listings right now in the county. Guess how many are 390 or less? 34. So that's less than 3% of the market is currently affordable to a family at the median income level. That's unbelievable. Now, pandemic, prices went crazy. Q1 of this year as compared to Q1 of last year, 11% higher. Simultaneously, and this is what's really, really important, the inventory is 40% lower than it was a year ago. So it's a supply and demand. Your demand is up, your supply is down, prices skyrocket. So that's what I would call the current mismatch in supply versus demand. Now, there are some solutions to that. And again, I think we're going to end up being able to circle back to that. So I'll stop for a moment when he didn't. Let it pass around the room some more.
Yeah, no. So Joe, you and Norma showed the assessment with you. I have the executive summary, if you can't see, with me, because the larger document is actually at my office. So Yeah, I wanted to get a little bit more into, we talked about the landscape that we're in right now in the county. And, we heard it from the Rothstein piece. David talked about it in his analysis of the county around housing segregation. I want to get more into a conversation about why is it important that we have fair housing and affordable housing as a way of addressing systemic racism. And so Sheila, I just saw Sheila disappear on me, but when she comes back, I definitely want to get her thoughts around this as well. So I want to start with Joe, if you want to, some of your thoughts around why.
Sure,
why
and I'm not quite sure why Sheila keeps dropping off, but it raises an issue in my mind immediately about broadband.
Yes.
And broadband, it's a critical piece of infrastructure, and this pandemic has highlighted the need for that infrastructure, not only for working purposes, but for education purposes. So Sheila, I hope you can join back in very, very soon. So the question in terms of why is affordable and fair housing essential to undoing systemic racism, a few thoughts come to mind. Increasing the supply of affordable housing will not undo systemic racism. I think it goes much, much deeper than just an inventory problem and a price problem. I think that understanding fair housing and mitigating discriminatory practices, it's a good start. But again, understanding the history is really, really important, and accepting the responsibility to fix it, not perpetuate the issue. That's my sort of knee-jerk reaction, Juanita, to some of those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful, because I know when I first started at CVH as the Yonkers organizer, actually the first person I met was David. And he told me to see the document, actually brick by brick, that was based off of Show Me a Hero, the book at first. Mm-hmm. And, the whole idea that where kids went to school was definitely impacted by where they lived. And when we started to see the number of, at that point, African-American kids, Latino kids, and how they were impacted by their housing and school piece, and all the anger around the fact of, just because you're a person of color, there was this idea that you didn't have the right to be in a particular neighborhood, you didn't have the right to housing. And so, like I said, when we talk about it at CVH, and when we started, talking about housing, we had to do the context of, look, a lot of this stuff is based on racist foundations, segregationist foundations, and we have to talk about it and be unapologetic about it, and then start to talk about ways of addressing it. So where housing is built is important. The fight for affordable housing ordinances, to me, is a racial issue, right? Because talking about who has access to those units and how many units is important, because when we're talking about different sizes and things of that nature. And I see Sheila jumped back on. So Sheila, I'm just gonna repeat the question. We're asking the question around why we think it's the need for affordable housing and fair housing is crucial to addressing systemic racism. I see she's
Sheila is still joining audio, but should be working in a few minutes.
Okay, perfect. I'll kick it over to David.
Okay, well, I mean, it just seems to me that the COVID, Joe mentioned the broadband, clearly became clear to all of us during the COVID crisis, and it depended on where you lived, what broadband you get. We know that it has to do with schooling. I read in today's Times that finally, how many years later, New York State may be finally funding the court case that required them to fund the inequality in in education funds in communities of color and poor communities. It's healthcare is less available in segregated communities. I mean, everything, to my mind, goes back to that the long-term solution is integration. We know that when people grow up in integrated communities, they do better in life. We know that. We all know it intuitively. And I'm not enough of a social scientist to lay my hands on the data tonight, but it's there. And so we must keep up this fight, not just for sufficient affordable housing, but as Juanita just said, for where that housing is built. And I want to say one other thing. We talk about units of housing. There are other ways of providing good, safe, appropriate, and integrated housing. Communities are resistant to auxiliary apartments. Why are they? When we had the battle in Dobbs Ferry, where I lived at the time, the language was frightening. It was frightening of the opponents to it. They will be coming. They, and we all know who they were talking about, will be coming if we have. So we need things like auxiliary apartments. We need emergency tenant protection acts. When we passed it in Ossining, they turned right around and repealed it. Why? There's no earthly reason other than systemic racism. So the one is the other. And the whole issue, I was so struck when I read Matthew Desmond's book on eviction, in which he reminds us that eviction is not the result of poverty, it's the cause of poverty. What do you lose when you lose your home? You lose all that stability in your life. You lose your children's education, et cetera, et cetera. So I see Sheila seemed to pop on, so I'm going to shut up.
David, you also lose dignity, which is incredibly important.
Absolutely. Right. And then Norma, and then I'll check in again with Sheila.
Yeah, that's fine. I always try to use a different example to get people to just think a little differently. When I have a dilemma or I have an issue that I need to think and solve, I don't want to surround myself with people who all think like I do. I want to bring different backgrounds and different voices to the table to help me get to the best solution. But if everybody's educated like I am, or everybody has the same background, the same history as me, all we're going to do is spin around in circles, because I'm just going to hear myself talk through the voices of other people. So the best way to approach so many issues is by having a diverse group of friends, a diverse group of neighbors, a diverse group of colleagues that you work with. I mean, there's no question that diversity leads to better answers in every arena. So, you know, I just always take that example and take it into the housing world. You know, a successful community needs people of all walks of life, whether, you know, it's the person who's cleaning the floors in the schools, whether it's the person driving our kids to school, whether it's the teachers in the school, the physical therapists, the principals, whoever it is. We need so many people from so many different walks of life, and they're going to make different salaries because of the nature of the work and the experience and the licenses and stuff that they need. But they all should be able to come to work comfortably without having to have been in an hour of traffic. You know, so a good community really needs so many diverse opportunities for housing to be able to make that community work well.
Thank you. Sheila, can you hear us? I want to echo Joe talking about broadband as a real thing, which has been highlighted even more with the pandemic. Sheila, can you hear us? So hopefully she comes back in.
Juanita, could I add a couple of more things?
Yeah, a couple more things. Yep.
I'm on a roll, sorry.
No, it's a good discussion.
So COVID showed us a bunch of things, and you know, Norma just ran through a list of people who work in our community. And what COVID did, you know, sometimes don't misunderstand me, anyone. Sometimes there's a silver lining in crises. And let's not let a good crisis go to waste. In thinking in terms of essential workers, who are the frontline workers? Who are the people we count on every single day to make our lives go? These are the folks that are making $12, $14, $13, $15 an hour. Those are the folks that are impacted immediately. Those are the folks that couldn't pay the rent. Those are the folks that are now maybe dealing with eviction. So it's critically important that we understand who they are as an essential worker And these are the people you want in your community. These are the people we need in our community. You don't need these people driving an hour or an hour and a half just to get to work. Imagine your daycare provider, the person that you're trusting to take care of your child all day, has a 3-hour commute. You need that person at their best. Wouldn't you want the best for your kid? So why would you want someone that's dealing with a long commute, the expense, because the expense of housing is cheaper further away from some of the metropolitan type cities in Westchester County. But there's also, I also wanted to get a little bit into what are we still seeing years later after, 1968 fair housing. What are we still seeing? Exclusionary zoning, for sure. Large lot subdivisions, minimum square footage, limited heights of building and number of units, no accessory dwelling units, high impact fees, redline communities, redlining neighborhoods. It's still happening. The zoning that is occurring for single family zoning, that is another term for redlining. Seeker, it's used to stop the development process. Comprehensive plans, they don't sufficiently cover housing. It's typically between 4 and 10 pages out of a 300-page document. Lending criteria, there's more strict underwriting and higher rates of denials. Face it, for the Black and brown community, it's still happening. Affordable housing, examine again the location of the development. Don't put it next to a water and sewer treatment plant. And of course, steering of buyers. It's subtle, but it still happens. Those are a couple things I just wanted to get off my mind, Juanita.
Yeah, no, and it's, and when you were talking about the workers, the essential workers during the pandemic who are in need of housing, for the funding, for the needs assessment, one of our sayings was, if we work here, we should live here, right? That's what it all comes down to. And so I know they're still trying to work out things with Sheila, but I want to go on to this next question around.
I'm here.
Oh, you are? Oh, yay, Sheila. Okay.
Yeah, I finally got in.
You got it. Great. So here's a question actually for you and thinking about the work that CVH and other activists do. Can you talk about how the fight for housing in particular has impacted you and others that you know at Community Voices Heard or other activists?
Okay, sure. Well, when I was being a Section 8 voucher holder, okay, when I received my voucher, I was looking for housing in Ossining. And I realized that I was having doors closed in my face. Not many landlords wanted to
Sheila, did we lose you? So I know Sheila's story, so hopefully she will come back on. But to finish that up, she was looking for.
I'm here.
Oh, yep, there we go. Never mind. See, work. Go ahead, Sheila.
Okay.
Finish your story.
And many landlords did not want to accept the program. So I had a lot of doors closed in my face, and I believe they only give you like 3 weeks to find housing when you have a voucher. It's time-based. And I was about to lose my voucher, and at the last minute, through word of mouth, I found housing. I found housing, but I was targeted by the landlord that I had once he found out that I was organizing tenants in my building. Faced with eviction, eventually I found another place to live. And after that, I was part of the team in Ossining that fought for the passage of the Emergency Tenant Protection.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to Sheila's story, that's just, oh, you back, Sheila? That's just one of the many stories that we hear, not just from CVH members, but just by community members that come into our offices, right? Either being discriminated against, not being able to find housing that's adequate for their family size, and or you know, in some cases that we've seen in other parts of the region, and particularly I think starting to see now in Westchester, when a landlord is selling a building, right? And there's very little notice for the tenant needing to find a place to live. And so, you know, that just shows and highlights the how this housing crisis is impacting, you know, low-income and working class folks and we're starting to see more and more people being impacted by this, particularly because of the pandemic. So one of the other questions I want to have, and one of our last questions, because I see a lot of good questions coming in the chat, and I want to make sure we get to some of them, is, you know, what are one or two things that can happen at the government level or even at the community level that would have the biggest impact towards our housing crisis here in addressing the housing crisis in Westchester?
Are you asking me that question?
Yep. Yes, because you are back on, and so I want to hear from you. Yes.
Okay, so you're asking me, okay, what are the two things that could be done by governments? Is that the question?
Yep, governor, community members that would make the biggest impact in addressing the housing situation or housing crisis in the county.
Okay, more funding for programs that promote access to housing and development, and let's see. Governments can invest into housing programs that get the information out to the community, programs that help monitor that the landlords are doing what they are supposed to, create programs that monitor the safety of the tenants' housing and their rights, and invest in programs that create more affordable units for low-income residents. Did you get that?
Yep, I got them all. Thanks, Sheila. David, what are some thoughts?
Well, I would, and the Working Families Party has been advocating for enforcement of the fair housing laws by the County of Westchester. And I want to just take people's moment to read you a portion of a paragraph from the consent decree and to remind everybody, despite the use of the word settlement that got sort of whitewash this whole thing, a consent decree is an order of a federal court. In the event that a municipality does not take actions needed to promote the objectives, and that's what we're talking about here, which is fair and affordable housing, the county shall use all available means as appropriate to address such action or inaction, including but not limited to pursuing legal action. And the county has begun, I believe, under the present administration to use county funding as a carrot and even as a stick in places, withholding it to move some of these recalcitrant communities. But I think it's time we went back into federal court and enforced the law.
Thank you, David. Norma, what are some of your thoughts that either government or community members could do to impact?
One of the things I have been waiting for is to see our co-op law amended. If there's one place that discrimination is so evident, it's in the ability for people to buy co-ops, where the co-op boards don't have to tell you why they're saying no. And you've met, clearly met all of the other criteria that have been established for other buyers in those areas. And we've got thousands and tens of thousands of co-ops in Westchester. And we've got a lot where, people have used those as an opportunity. They are some of our most affordable housing in Westchester in the natural market. And people have used those as places where they've now retired to. So I believe we're going to see a lot of co-ops coming on the market in the next couple of years. And so I want to see that law strengthened so that as those units start to come on board, more people have the opportunity to get those housing opportunities as they open up.
Joe.
So mitigating development barriers like restrictive zoning. I talked before a little bit about the comprehensive plan and how important zoning is. Streamlining the approval process, I think that's critical. Aligning zoning, the local review, taxes and incentives, and access to subsidies during the development process. All of these things need to work together. There's no single solution. Waiving local fees when you're developing affordable housing. There's a couple of communities, they have $5,000 per unit fees for an to create an environmental fund. Now, who's paying for that? Guess who? The rent, right? Who's paying the rent? Provide set aside. You know, David, I think earlier you were speaking about 10% set aside. So if your goal for a community is to create 1,000 affordable units, that means you have to build 10,000 to get to the 1,000. So I think the percentage can be increased, but there also has to be a foundational understanding about the data in the underwriting of how developments work in order to maximize the set aside. You can't just say to a developer, you have to make half of the units affordable, because certain developments will just simply not cash flow. There are analyses that need to take place. Reduce parking requirements. Not everybody has a car. There's some communities up in this part of the region who require 2.5 parking spots per unit. That's ridiculous, because it's the cost up front, it's the long-term maintenance, and it's an environmental issue. Again, accessory dwelling units, develop mixed use and mixed income developments, provide housing rehab grants, we mentioned that. Code enforcement is really critical. The housing vouchers, everybody talked a little bit about that, and they are time-based. And that represents a big issue, and it's a federal policy that I think needs to be changed, because local agencies actually run the risk of losing the voucher if they can't get their utilization rate high enough. So if their numbers are low, the feds are going to say, well, then maybe you just don't need it. That's not the case. It's just a supply issue. Increase fair housing testing. Why not? This has to happen, right? Educate local planning and zoning boards on the need for affordable housing. As Norma said, have that conversation. That's really important. Educate other decision makers. Again, village boards, city councils, town boards. But overall, I would say, don't do all this for people. Do it with people. I think that's really Norma mentioned it, and spend the time to have the conversation, understand the issues, and understand each other's concerns. There's concerns on both sides of the table. You have to understand both sides. We're living in such a polarized and divisive world. It's not this way or this way. There's got to be a way to come to the middle and understand both sides. Is it going to be perfect for two different sides that have opposing views? No, but I think there's a place to compromise and come into the middle.
Great. Thank you. So I see a couple of questions popping in the chat, so I want to get to a couple of them. So one is, how can real estate investors help to better remedy the affordable housing crisis and situation? So I'm just going to open that up. So how can real estate investors play a role in having some remedies for affordable housing and the housing crisis that we have?
Juanita, later in the series, what we're going to hear from Rich Nightingale of West Hab, and he and others can tell us that it is possible, particularly if you can have a scale large enough to make it financially feasible, using tax vouchers to build affordable housing. It's a matter of communities making the land available, not keeping them out through its zoning. They have to provide affordable multi-family housing or whatever that would allow the developer to build a reasonable size, and that using federal tax vouchers, it is possible to achieve housing. And I think if communities would reach out to these developers of affordable housing, in addition to requiring the market rate developers to set aside units, if they would reach out to these both for-profit and not-for-profit developers of affordable housing, they would find that was true. But they don't reach out to them. They, quite the opposite. They make it difficult in too many instances and require quarter-acre lots or half-acre lots or acre lots, and then that's the end of a chance to have workable affordable housing development.
Cool. Any other thoughts quickly before we go on to this next question?
Sure. Juanita, you know, so the demand's outpacing the supply, right? Wages not keeping up with the costs. But David, to react a little bit of what you said, there's an insufficient supply of state and federal resources. You mentioned the low-income housing tax credit. That is unbelievably competitive. Just in Westchester County alone, if there are 2 developments per year that can get funded, you're doing well. The balance of the Hudson Valley region, it's usually just 2 per year. And those are usually developments of 80 to maybe 100 units. That's about the size that HCR likes to fund. So there's an absolute resource shortage. And there's also a local not-for-profit capacity issue. There's so many dollars available for not-for-profits for programs, but that core operating dollar, that's not necessarily easy to get. And that's the those are the numbers that are needed to keep your operation going. It pays rent, it pays for computers, it pays for healthcare, it pays for all of those other things that you need to keep the lights on. I was very glad to hear Darren Walker, who is the CEO of the Ford Foundation. I listened to him on Sunday night on the news, and he was indicating that he wants to flip the Ford Foundation on its side. And he wants to look at examining the need for not-for-profits to actually get the operating subsidy that they need, not just put it into programs. But he actually made a comment. I believe he said it's actually arrogant for foundations to believe otherwise. And I think he's right, because not-for-profits, you can't have a starving foundation or a starving organization trying to serve starving people. There's a mismatch there as well. And of course, NIMBY, it still remains an issue no matter what. So we've got to have these, you've got to have these conversations, and you've got to educate the local decision makers. I can't say that enough.
Yeah, totally agree. So the other question is, can affordable housing requirements be set at the county level instead of the municipality level? I feel like all of us can say that answer together. Go ahead, Norma. I'll kick it over to you.
So yeah, the requirements can certainly be, there's a lot of policies that the county puts out, model ordinances. We came out with an accessory dwelling unit model ordinance. Our senior housing model ordinance should be out very, very soon. So yeah, at the policy level, yes, but the problem is that in Westchester and in New York State, local municipalities control the zoning. And it's actually the zoning that allows whether that lot is going to be used for multifamily or for single family or for industrial use or commercial use or educational use or open space. So that's where and in other places, the counties do have more control of zoning, but just not here in Westchester or in New York State.
Juanita, I think it's important to understand that there's a carrot and stick. And so, economic development, I like to say it's intrinsically linked to housing. In order to retain and in order to attract business, affordable housing is key. You have to have somewhere for your employees to work. So what can a county do in terms of economic development? Well, they can offer incentives. They can extend a water and sewer line. They can have land available for these large corporations to move into. So if they want to provide that incentive, then they can say to the local municipality, so in return, you've got to give affordable housing. It's a carrot and stick, if you ask me.
And Joe, you started to hit on this a little bit, but I want to open this to everyone. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between affordable housing and transportation? So we definitely talked about it. And so transportation, housing, all that's connected to economic development, right? And then access to schools and what have you, because we don't always hear about the connection between those two particular things.
Sure. So, a lot of the statistics that we've thrown out so far, we talk about cost burden and severely cost burden, where people are paying over 30 or over 50% of their income towards rent. when you add on the cost of transportation, especially when someone has to drive, use a train to get to work that's further away, that cost goes up. So all of a sudden, now you're looking at this, there's a formula, it's called H+T index, which is housing plus transportation index. And in many cases, in many of the communities in Westchester County, that cost is as much as 67, 70% of income that goes to housing transportation. Now, we all know what food costs. Where do you get your food? Where do you get your clothing? Where do you get, oh, I don't know, baby formula? Where do you get money to put, the gas not to get the utilities on your home itself? All of those things cost money. So when you look at, some different national studies, Economic Policy Institute, EPI, they put out costs for things. What does it really cost in Westchester County to live? And those numbers are extraordinarily high. And I may have this number wrong, but I'll throw it out there. I think it's about $189,000 a year you need. Substantial number.
Norma, and then I'll have this last question to close us out.
Sure. So back in the 80s, Westchester was so well known for the fact that we were the home to so many Fortune 500s, and they each and every one of them wanted their own office campus. Okay. And so we developed all of these office parks along 287 and along, up in Rye Brook and all these other places that are now sitting vacant and now redeveloped, and we're trying to repurpose them at this point. And what are we putting into them to make them successful? Housing, because it wasn't there before. And so people who can minimize their transportation costs because they can now live close to where they work can actually, if they need to, accept it even a lower wage if they have to, because they can minimize their other costs. But building housing near transportation or including housing in those corporate office parks is absolutely the way to go in terms of revitalizing all of these parks here in Westchester.
Great. And the last question is, if there are existing housing and zoning policies that are racist and exclusionary, what is the complementary work for interpersonal and collective anti-racism and inclusionary work, excuse me. So again, the question is, if the existing housing and zoning policies, I think we've all acknowledged that are exclusionary and racist, what complementary work is happening that's addressing collectively around anti-racism and inclusionary work? So what's the work being done to undo the racist policies that we have in the county?
I mean, the most prominent one that the county came out with was our model ordinance provisions. Okay, so fair and affordable housing, 2010, we developed under the housing settlement, no question. We developed a model ordinance of about 14 or 15 different things for local municipalities to just take and adopt wholesale in their code, or take and pick what was most appropriate for them with the sizes of the units, including extra units, giving density bonuses, putting approval of the affordable housing developments at the top of their agenda so that, people don't have to wait till the end to get approvals. The marketing, the affirmative fair housing marketing that should be done anytime units, particularly affordable units are created, to make sure that we're not just housing our own residents there, but that we're opening up this housing to everybody. What happens when people become over income? That's even included in those policies as well. So we've gotten about 20 of the municipalities in Westchester to adopt them, of the 31 eligible, because the more diverse cities didn't have any obligation to adopt those. But we continue to remind every municipality that hasn't adopted those model ordinance provisions the fact that they still are, we still encourage them to consider them, because one of the most important things we felt that those provisions accomplished was standardizing the conversation about what we mean by affordable housing here in the county, so that customers and people looking for housing didn't have to worry about what Irvington's definition was versus, Hastings and Tarrytown on the other sides of them. It just was crazy, the fact that different municipalities had different definitions. So but yeah, encouraging and continuing to encourage municipalities to adopt those model ordinance provisions is, and other model ordinance provisions that we put out there is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you around the, using the model ordinances, but I think the other part too is that there needs to be more of an explicit conversation around race and segregation in Westchester County and how those policies came to be because of that. And so, Richard Rothstein definitely talks about that in his book at the national level, but David pointed out some very local things. And so because of those local instances, that's how we have a lot of these laws that are exclusionary and are continuing some racist practices. So, I see some people in the chat are saying that there needs to be some anti-racism, undoing racism trainings for all, elected officials and government administrators, because how we act at our core dictates the policies that are created, right? So I know this, I'm glad that we're having this conversation and that this is part of the whole series, because I think it's an ongoing discussion that we have to have, that we're gonna hopefully get to some solutions and some action, which are gonna be the next two pieces of the series. So I just wanna let folks know, if we weren't able to get to your question, we will definitely send these out to our panelists and have some answers that we can send out in a follow-up. But I wanna thank our panelists. I wanna thank Sheila and David and Norma and Joe for being a part of our first series and for kicking off this super important conversation around housing and segregation in Westchester County. So I want to turn it over to Abe or Joan for our next.
So I can take it for a few moments. Thank you so much, Juanita, and thank you so much to Norma, David, and Joe for this amazing panel. I just want to share quickly the word cloud to which everyone contributed, so we can see, what people were thinking about Westchester housing. So hopefully you can see this. So interesting to see what people were thinking about. A lot of the things that we've heard discussed tonight made it into this word cloud. And with that, I will stop sharing this and pass it over to Joan for some closing words.
Thank you so much, Juanita. You brought it today, as you always do. And thank you to our panelists, certainly Sheila and Norma and Joe and David. It was a very rich conversation, and to Juanita's point, a very necessary conversation. And this is only the start of it. There are 2 more sessions to this webinar series. I'd also like to just give a shout out. We had a lot of elected officials on the Zoom with us this evening, and I just, some of them caught my eye as I was scanning the attendees, and we had several county legislators, Johnson and Mayer and Clements and Walter. I saw Frank Gordon out of Harrison, some folks from Jamal Bowman's staff, Quantel Bazemore, and I'm sorry if I did not mention you if you were here, but thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody who came this evening and stayed and hung out with us. And again, we will be sending out some resources that you might find interesting. Certainly The Color of Law is a fascinating book, and we encourage you all to pick that up. And we will be sharing with our follow-up the link to this recording, as well as some additional resources for people who want to become better informed. And so once again, thank you, Abe, you did it again. Thanks so much. And again, we'll be back April 21st, 7 p.m. Watch this space and have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you soon. Have a good night, everybody.